Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the second part of a four-part series, Presidential Trappings, organized by New Canaan Library and the New Canaan Museum and Historical Society. My name is Kayla Del Biondo. I'm the coordinator of adult programming and outreach at the library, and I invite everyone to register for the remainder of the series on the library's website calendar if you've yet to do so, where subject experts will cover presidential libraries next week and the history of ballot design the following week. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Ronald Schurin, to speak on presidential inaugurations through the years and the four categories that they fall into: ritual of orderly transition, moment of reassurance, sign of dramatic change, or something else. Ron Schurin is Associate Professor in Residence in the Department of Political Science at the University of Connecticut, where he teaches courses on American political parties, Connecticut politics, education policy, and politics and literature. A native of New York, he holds a Master's of Public Affairs from Princeton University and a PhD in Political Science from the City University of New York, where his dissertation focused on Franklin Roosevelt's efforts to transform the American party system. Prior to coming to UConn, Ron served in the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare during the Carter administration and at the City University of New York, excuse me. Without further ado, I'd like to thank Ron for speaking with us tonight and give him the floor.
Thank you, Kayla. Let me begin with just a few comments. This presentation, this series really commemorates the presidency, which is one of our most revered institutions. We don't have a royal family in the United States, nor do we have a state religion. What we do have is a set of institutions, traditions, customs that have evolved over time and are truly important as things that define what we are as a national community. People need that, societies need that, and things like inaugurations give us a sense of belonging and at their best, a sense of majesty that helps us function as a democracy. The events of the last week, what led up to them, what happened, the aftermath that we're now in, they should remind us all that our democracy is as fragile as it is precious, and that it's up to all of us to work to preserve it. Presidential inaugurations are among the great rituals of our democracy, and it's a ritual that, despite all of the current turbulence, will have another chapter next week. And with that, let me begin a discussion of the 57 presidential inaugurations in our past and the ones that we will witness a week from now. Thank you. John F. Kennedy. First inauguration, I think, that I remember, and we can hear a little video clip from John F. Kennedy's famous inaugural address.
Not a victory of party, but a celebration of freedom, symbolizing an end as well as a beginning, signifying renewal as well as change. For I have sworn before you and Almighty God the same solemn oath our forebears prescribed nearly a century and 3/4 ago. The world is very different now. For man.
So that basically sums up where we are and where we're headed next week. George Washington's inauguration, to begin at the beginning, on April 30th, 1789, not in Washington, D.C., which hadn't been constructed yet, but in New York City, our temporary capital, on the balcony of Federal Hall. This was the first formal presidential inauguration. As mentioned, there have been 57 since then, and another 9 subdued ceremonies in which vice presidents were sworn in to fill presidents' unexpired terms. Washington's inauguration was a little bit late, supposed to be March 4th, because it took that much time to get all the key participants in place. Next slide. You can see Washington taking the oath, and he gives a first inaugural address. He says, "I have, in obedience to the public summons, repaired to the present station it would be peculiarly improper to admit in this first official act my fervent supplications to that almighty being who rules over the universe. Religious invocations have been a constant theme in inaugural addresses, sometimes at some length, most times more muted. Next slide. The oath. Before the president begins his term of office, the Constitution says, he shall take the following oath or affirmation. I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. Every president has taken that oath. Trivia test, for those of you who are interested. Actually, you've already got the answer up. Who was the only president to affirm rather than swear? And it was Franklin Pierce, who's not remembered for many things, but may be remembered for that. But I want to say that there was no more tragic presidential inauguration than that of our 14th president. Franklin Pierce was inaugurated in 1853. He was one of the dark horse presidential candidates, kind of plucked out of New Hampshire as a compromise choice. He was ambitious, but his wife, Jane, did not want to leave New Hampshire, did not want him to run, and was very unhappy that he had accepted the nomination, but she reluctantly went along with it. However, a few weeks prior to their departure for Washington, there was a train accident. And before their eyes, before the eyes of Franklin and Jane Pierce, their only surviving son, Benjamin, was killed in that train accident. So Pierce begins his inaugural address with the words, "It is a relief to know that no heart but my own can know the personal regret and bitter sorrow over which I have been born to a position so suitable for others rather than desirable for myself." Next slide. Well, the inauguration used to take place on March 4th, but there was a very long interregnum between the November election and that March inauguration. Used to be required because it took quite a bit of time for people to get things together and to get from one place to another. But by the 1920s, it came to seem too long, and Congress passed and the states ratified the 20th Amendment, the lame duck amendment to the Constitution, which, among other things, said that presidential inaugurations would now take place on the 20th of January. The first presidential inauguration to take place after the ratification of the 20th Amendment was of, trivia question, Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1937. Next slide. You can see, if you look carefully, umbrellas being held. As it turned out, that year, March 4th was a beautiful day. Had the inauguration been on March 4th, it would have been bright and sunny. But January 20th was cold and rainy, and there Franklin Roosevelt stood taking the oath of office for the second time. Next slide. We have a video clip of that.
Here is the challenge to our democracy. In this nation, I see tens of millions of its citizens, a substantial part of its whole population, who at this very moment are denied the greater part of what the very lowest standards of today call the necessities of life. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. But it is not in despair that I paint that picture for you.
That 1/3 of a nation, ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished, was a famous phrase that was often repeated. It was Roosevelt's signal that, having dealt with the crisis of the Depression, now he was going to seek to remedy the inequities of society. Well, as of today, we might say we have 1/5 of a nation that is suffering from ill housing, ill clothing, ill nourishment, We have made progress, but not nearly the progress that FDR dreamed of. But speaking of the weather, in Washington, D.C., the normal temperature on January 20th is a little bit warmer than it is here in Connecticut, ranging from 28 to 43 degrees. There is a 1 in 6 chance of precipitation and a 1 in 6 chance there will be snow on the ground from a previous snowfall. Ronald Reagan had the warmest inauguration, on January 20th inauguration, 55 degrees in 1981. You may remember, as I certainly do, that on that day, the hostages that had been held in Iran were released. And there were some who said, Reagan has luck and will bring luck to the United States. But 4 years later, Ronald Reagan had the coldest inauguration, 7 degrees in 1985, and that ceremony had to be held indoors, and the parade was moved to the Washington Armory and much abbreviated to the great dismay of high school bands from all over the country that had planned to participate. Most snow was March 4th, 1909, William Howard Taft, who didn't really want to be president, and he said, well, even the elements do protest. And the second most was January 20th, that clip that we saw, John F. Kennedy, 8 inches on the ground. Donald Trump's inauguration 4 years ago, rather warm day, 48 degrees, there was a light sprinkling of rain. Next slide. The location, as mentioned, presidential inauguration, first one was in New York in 1789. The capital then moved to Philadelphia. And in 1793, Washington's second inaugural and John Adams' inaugural in 1797 took place in Philadelphia. Every formal inauguration since then, not vice presidents succeeding to the presidency, has been in Washington, D.C., and it has always been at the Capitol building, except for 1945, Franklin Roosevelt's fourth inauguration. We were at war. Roosevelt was in ill health. It made the most sense for all kinds of reasons to have the inauguration on the back porch of the White House, the South Portico. Roosevelt gave a very brief speech, the second briefest since George Washington, and his son, who was assisting him, later wrote that he was very worried that Roosevelt, who had been complaining of chest pains, might collapse. What would happen, the son was wondering, if he collapsed before he took the oath as opposed to after he took the oath? But Roosevelt stood, the last time in his life that he stood with his braces, and gave a 5-minute address. Have a little clip of that.
It means optimism, perseverance,
and injustice,
tenacity,
staying positive in times of struggle.
Now I'm in the United States, and I can see my dream.
We're Americans. We dream it, we can make it happen.
Freedom to be who we are without fear.
And the president moved out to the porch, behind the Chief Justice and the 2 vice presidents, old and new. 2 men lifted him out of his chair to an upright position. He held on to the handles on the desk with both hands. During the first part of the speech, it looked as though his right arm was straining a good deal. It was trembling.
You will understand, and I believe agree with my wish, that the form of this inauguration be simple and its words brief.
FDR had not attempted to stand in public for 3 months. His inaugural address was the shortest since George Washington, less than 5 minutes. But his message was pure Roosevelt.
We shall strive for perfection. We shall not achieve it immediately, but we still shall strive. We may make mistakes, but they must never be mistakes which result from faintness of heart or abandonment of moral principle.
Next slide, please. By law and by custom, the speech takes place with every inauguration except when the vice president succeeds, and sometimes it does even then. Not called for in the Constitution, Washington, as mentioned, began the tradition in 1789, but his second inaugural address was barely a speech at all, the shortest on record. The longest inaugural address was William Henry Harrison's in 1841, 8,000 words, 1 hour and 40 minutes. Daniel Webster claimed that he had cut the speech in half. So God only knows how long it would have been had Webster not taken his cutting scissors to that speech. Little trivia question. The only president not to use the word I in his inaugural address was, and the answer is Theodore Roosevelt in 1905. Next slide, please. You see Washington's very short second inaugural address, the relevant sentence, "This oath I am now about to take, and in your presence, that if it shall be found during my administration of the government I have in any instance violated willingly or knowingly the injunction thereof, I may, besides incurring constitutional punishment, be subject to the upbraidings of all who now witness the present solemn ceremony." Kind of archaic language, but it might be good for all presidents to remember that injunction. Next slide, please. Harrison. Famously, William Henry Harrison was 68 years old when he was inaugurated, oldest president up to that time. He wished to prove how vigorous he was, and also because he was characterized as a rough-hewn frontiersman, not a fair characterization, he wanted to prove how smart he was. So he gave that very lengthy speech, didn't wear a coat, in the process caught a cold which turned into pneumonia, and as you see in the second picture, 1 month later, died. Shortest presidential tenure in history. Theodore Roosevelt was the first president, I am told, to give his speech bareheaded, even though it was a somewhat chilly day, and again, did not use the word I. We do not think of Teddy Roosevelt as someone with any ego problems, so the non-use of the personal pronoun is somewhat interesting. Next slide. What purpose does the presidential inauguration serve? Well, it serves the constitutional purpose, but beyond that, a routine renewal and ratification of our democratic norms, reassurance in times of national crisis, an occasion to set new goals and signify the dawn of a new era, and commemorating the transfer of power. Next slide. Routine renewal. Most inaugurations are indeed routine, and they fit into this category. Often they are second term inaugurals, and many, frankly, are forgotten, but not all. But even some of the routine inaugurations are notable since they indicate, by being routine, a return to normalcy. Next slide. Routine inauguration soon forgotten. Zachary Taylor in 1849, it was a rainy day. He spoke, it was said, to a massive assemblage of umbrellas. Woodrow Wilson in 1917. Trivia question, the answer is here. He was the last president to ride to his inauguration in a horse-drawn carriage. There is Wilson with his second wife, Edith, who came to play a very important role after Wilson suffered a stroke in 1918, and Edith became his de facto assistant and some said acting president. Calvin Coolidge in 1925, typical grim visage on Coolidge's face, not so his very cheerful wife, Grace. Next slide. Harry Truman. The first picture on the left shows Truman taking the oath of office, having been told of Franklin Roosevelt's death on April 12, 1945. Truman, as vice president presiding over the Senate, was called to the White House, but didn't know why and thought, well, this is nice. The president wants to see me. Roosevelt had only seen him twice since they were both inaugurated on January 20th, 1945. When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt put her hand on his shoulder and said, "Harry, the president is dead." Truman gulped and said, "Can I help you?" And Eleanor said, "What can we do to help you? You're the one in trouble now." And indeed, he had to deal with the completion of a war in Europe, war in the Pacific, the conversion to a peacetime economy, holding together the Democratic Party, and forging a new post-war world order. He also faced, almost 4 years later, what seemed like an impossible re-election campaign, which to everyone's surprise he won. And in 1949, he was reinaugurated, I should say, in a great ceremony at the Capitol. Next slide, please. Again, another similar situation, famous iconic photo of Lyndon Johnson on the plane, Air Force One, taking the oath of office after John Kennedy's assassination in Dallas. You see Johnson with his wife Lady Bird on one side of him and the newly widowed Jacqueline Kennedy on the other side. Johnson called for a federal district judge whom he knew and whom he had helped get appointed, Sarah Hughes, to come to swear him in, first woman ever to fulfill that function. And Johnson then said, "Let's get this plane off the ground." Little more than a year later, Johnson, reelected by a massive majority, takes the oath of office at a Capitol Hill ceremony in 1965. Next slide. Gerald Ford. First president to resign was Richard Nixon. Gerald Ford takes the oath in 1974 at a time of great national distress. He fails in his effort to be elected to a full term and is succeeded by Jimmy Carter, who in a very joyous inauguration takes the oath of office and then, in an unprecedented move with his wife Rosalind, walks from the Capitol to the White House. Next slide. Here I have a clip of Ford's, I think, wonderful speech after taking the oath of office in 1974. Go ahead.
Mr. Chief Justice, my dear friends, my fellow Americans, the oath that I have taken is the same oath that was taken by George Washington and by every president under the Constitution. But I assume the presidency under extraordinary circumstances never before experienced by Americans. This is an hour of history that troubles our minds and hurts our hearts. Therefore, I feel it is my first duty to make an unprecedented compact with my countrymen. Not an inaugural address, not a fireside chat, not a campaign speech. Just a little straight talk among friends, and I intended to be the first of many. I am acutely aware that you have not elected me as your president by your ballots. So I ask you to confirm me as your president with your prayers. And I hope that such prayers will also be the first of many. If you have not chosen me by secret ballot, neither have I gained office by any secret promises. I have not campaigned either for the presidency or the vice presidency. I have not subscribed to any partisan platform. I am indebted to no man, and only to one woman, my dear wife, as I begin this very difficult job. I have not sought this enormous responsibility, but I will not shirk it. Those who nominated and confirmed me as vice president were my friends and are my friends. They were of both parties, elected by all the people and acting under the Constitution in their name. It is only fitting, then, that I should pledge to them and to you that I will be the president of all the people. Thomas Jefferson said the people are the only sure reliance for the preservation of our liberty. And down the years, Abraham Lincoln renewed this American article of faith, asking, is there any better way for equal hope in the world?
Are we on now? Cale? Okay. I didn't have the clip that included that where Ford famously says our long national nightmare is over. Another normal but intense inauguration was that of Barack Obama in 2009. Massive crowds in Washington, record-breaking, still that record stands to this day, and Obama, like Jimmy Carter, with his wife Michelle, walked from the Capitol to the White House. Next slide, please. Above all, in terms of inaugurations, was that of Abraham Lincoln in 1865. It was routine in the sense that it took place on the assigned date and time and represented the continuation of an administration, but it was certainly not routine for other reasons. It was a wartime inauguration, like that of James Madison in 1813 and FDR in 1945. A fractured nation, the Civil War was coming to its end. The presence, notably, of Frederick Douglass and other African-American special guests, the first African-Americans to be special guests at the White House, and actually that would stand for some time to come. And of course, it was the most memorable inaugural address in all of American history. Next slide, please. There you see one of the early photographs of a presidential inaugural address, Frederick Douglass, and you see Lincoln sitting with his vice president, Andrew Johnson. Lincoln, as many of you know, chose Johnson as his vice president to get support in the border states and support of those who were not wholeheartedly in support of African-American civil rights, but wanted to preserve the Union. Johnson had been a Democratic senator, had left the Democratic Party, and had stayed in the Senate when his state of Tennessee seceded. So he was a Union loyalist. He was ill on the day of the inauguration, and to see himself through it, drank a healthy slug of brandy and became drunk, and created one of the most embarrassing spectacles in American inaugural history, which Lincoln had to devote a fair amount of energy to covering up. Next slide, please. Okay, the inaugural, I will just, you see much of the inaugural address here, which is carved into the Lincoln Memorial. The final sentence of that inaugural address is the most famous of any sentence of an inaugural address, and indeed one of the most famous sentences in American literature. With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Tragically, in a matter of weeks, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and Andrew Johnson, under the cloud of his drunken inaugural performance and much else, succeeded. Next slide. Second function an inauguration can serve is reassurance in times of national crisis. Again, without a monarch or a state church, Americans look to national rituals like those involving the president for a sense of reassurance in times of crisis. The crisis can be military, as in the case of the Civil War, economic, as in the case of FDR's inauguration in 1933, the result of national dissension, as was the case in the late 1960s, or a pandemic, as the case now. Next slide. Roosevelt in 1933. Famous sentence. First of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed efforts to convert retreat into advance. Sending the signal of optimism in a time of deep economic distress. Within a matter of days, Roosevelt put his optimism to work by closing the banks to give Americans a sense that they would be all examined and could be reopened with confidence. And the first 100 days of the Roosevelt administration witnessed a torrent of measures to put the country back to work and seek to begin to resolve the crisis. Of course, the Depression lingered for many years, but Roosevelt's optimism was a signpost that one could still have hope. Next slide. There you see the inauguration, just a few words. Go ahead, please.
Oh, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance. In every dark hour of our national life.
Okay, next slide, please. Still on Roosevelt, 1941, war in Europe. Roosevelt had pledged to try to keep the country out of war, but many thought that that was an impossible goal. Whether or not we got into the war, there were many who were terrified by the advance of fascism, both in Europe and in Asia. Roosevelt, elected to an unprecedented third term in 1940, sought to give the country reassurance, not that we would definitely stay out of the war, but that our system of government, our system of liberty, could survive. Democracy, he said, is not dying. We know it because we have seen it revive and grow. We know it cannot die because democracy alone, of all forms of government, enlists the full force of men's enlightened will. Next slide. A troubled time, late 1960s. Richard Nixon. We don't associate Nixon much with the president giving us reassurance, but he sought to do that in his inauguration in 1969. You may remember the 1960s as a time of great turbulence. I certainly do. Nixon sought to not enunciate a set of policies, but convey a mood. And he said in that speech, "Greatness comes in simple trappings. The simple things are the ones most needed today if we are to surmount what divides us and cement what unites us. To lower our voices would be a simple thing." Some of that could apply today as well. Of course, the Nixon administration was not remembered for an administration of lowered voices. Nevertheless, that was the goal he enunciated in 1969. Next slide, please. President Obama in 2009, a time of economic crisis, the possibility that we would suffer a depression not seen since the 1930s. Obama sought to remind us in 2009 that we remain, despite our problems, the most prosperous, powerful nation on earth. And he said, "With hope and virtue, let us brave once more the icy currents and endure what storms may come. Let it be said by our children's children that when we were tested, we refused to let this journey end, that we did not turn back, nor did we falter, and with eyes fixed on the horizon and God's grace upon us, we carried forth that great gift of freedom and delivered it safely to future generations." Next slide. An inauguration can also signify the dawn of a new era and of new national goals. Goes beyond simply outlining an agenda, sets high and maybe unachievable goals, as Roosevelt did with his plan to eradicate poverty, setting a new course for the nation. This is usually in a time of real or perhaps manufactured crisis. Next slide. Again, FDR, 1937, that quote that we saw before, about the 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. Next slide. Ronald Reagan, 1981. Reagan, the first avowedly conservative president elected really since the 1920s. And he sought to make his philosophy clear and use it as a framework in which new goals could be set. He said that the economic ills that we suffer have come upon us over several decades. They will not go away in a short period of time, but they will go away. They will go away because we as Americans have the capacity now, as we have had in the past, to do whatever needs to be done to preserve this last and greatest bastion of freedom. In this present crisis, he says, enunciating his conservative philosophy, government is not the solution to our problem, as certainly Franklin Roosevelt believed it was. Government is the problem, a radical departure. New slide. Then commemorating the transfer of power. An old elite has been defeated. A new force of the previously oppressed, the disregarded, or the powerless is now in charge. A new era in American life has begun. Next slide. John Adams yielding the presidency to Thomas Jefferson. Many feel that of all the great services John Adams rendered to our nation, the greatest was that when he was defeated for re-election in the election of 1800, Inauguration Day came on March 4th. Adams did not call out the troops, did not call for a recount of votes, did not cast doubt on the legitimacy of the election. He simply packed his belongings and got in his horse-drawn carriage and left. He didn't go to the inauguration. That was not yet the full tradition, and Adams was certainly in no good mood, but he left, and power was transferred to Thomas Jefferson. Next slide. John Adams' son, John Quincy Adams, was likewise defeated for a second term in the election of 1828, defeated by Andrew Jackson. Jackson was the first non-elite president, although by that time he'd become a wealthy planter. He was the tribune of the common man. Now we'd say the common man and woman. And when he was inaugurated in 1829, John Quincy, like his father, didn't go to the inauguration, but simply packed up and left. But by the thousands, and it was no easy thing in those days, a crowd came to Washington, D.C. to celebrate in a wild, raucous way. In fact, the crowd got so raucous that they went into the White House for the grand reception, and it got so crowded, full of hard partying people, that Jackson himself climbed out a window and walked back to the boarding house where he had lived. Someone finally got the idea of putting a huge cheese out in the front lawn of the White House, and a big vat of wine, and that led the crowd out of the White House. Many in the elite thought this was a horrible harbinger of things to come. Next slide. William Howard Taft, whom we mentioned earlier, didn't want to be president, but he served a rather difficult 4 years as president and was challenged by his predecessor, Theodore Roosevelt, who ran as a third-party candidate against Taft. And this split the Republican vote, so Woodrow Wilson, the Democrat, got elected. Taft was not brokenhearted, as you can see in this picture. Taft graciously turned over the reins of power to Woodrow Wilson. And in fact, after the swearing-in ceremony and the inaugural address, there was, by custom at that time, and still now, a luncheon in the Capitol for the new president. And Wilson, ever courteous, turned to Taft and said, "Would you like to join us for the luncheon?" Thinking Taft would politely decline. And to his surprise, Taft, I guess who never wanted to pass up a good meal, happily accepted. Next slide. Herbert Hoover had been elected in 1928 and promised in his inaugural address that poverty would soon be banished from the land. Of course, that did not happen. Stock market crash of 1929 and the ensuing depression. Hoover was defeated in a landslide by Franklin Roosevelt, then the governor of New York. Hoover was unhappy at his defeat, but accepted it. But in the weeks leading up to the inauguration, as the banking crisis grew and banks were closing all over the country, Hoover wanted Roosevelt, now president-elect, to join him in a set of policies that Hoover thought would save the banking industry. Roosevelt wanted to get into office in a moment of crisis where he could seize control and capture the imagination of the nation and firmly assert his own policies. And so he managed to avoid Hoover's imprecations to join him in his banking policies. This deeply embittered Hoover. He was an angry man when he rode with Franklin Roosevelt to FDR's inauguration in 1933. They never spoke again. Next slide. Harry Truman, elected surprisingly in 1948, had a second term that was characterized by the birth of McCarthyism, the Korean War, a number of problems. Truman decided not to run again in 1952 and was succeeded by Dwight D. Eisenhower. Truman and Eisenhower knew each other well. Eisenhower had been a military leader when Truman succeeded to the presidency. But Truman resented Eisenhower's attacks on his administration, and particularly the fact that Eisenhower didn't come to the defense of Truman's Secretary of Defense, George Marshall, and in fact accepted or allowed to happen Joseph McCarthy's attacks on Marshall. So Truman was an angry man. But they met, they had a rather cold meeting to talk about the transition, and then went to the inauguration a few days later. On their ride to the inauguration, President to-be Eisenhower noted that Eisenhower's son, John, who was fighting in Korea, had been called back from Korea to attend the inauguration. And Eisenhower said, "I wonder who ordered that and who is trying to embarrass me." Truman was furious and said, "The President of the United States ordered that." They also didn't speak for several years, although later there was a rapport. Next slide. President Eisenhower transferred power to John Kennedy. He wrote in his memoirs that he was very impressed by John Kennedy, whom he had not known well before. Kennedy had wished to have top hats worn at the inauguration, which Eisenhower had not done at his inauguration. As Eisenhower was walking out, Mamie Eisenhower said, "Look at Ike in his top hat. He looks like Paddy the Irishman." Next slide, please. George H.W. Bush, I'm sure, was deeply disappointed by being defeated by President Bill Clinton, but they had a very cordial transfer of power, and Bush warmly greeted Clinton and, of course, attended the inauguration. Next slide. President Obama and Michelle Obama greeted the Trumps. I think the expression on Michelle Obama's face speaks for itself. Next slide. The transfer of power to Donald Trump witnessed in his inaugural address. We assembled here today are issuing a new decree to be heard in every city, every foreign capital, and every hall of power. From this day forward, a new vision will govern our land. From this moment on, it's going to be America first. I will fight for you with every breath in my body, and I will never, ever let you down. Next slide, please. The ride. This is part of our tradition. We will not see it in this upcoming inauguration because President Trump has said he will not attend. But you see Eisenhower and Truman. You see Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. As Jimmy Carter was riding to the inauguration with Reagan, he was taking phone calls about the imminent release of the hostages in Iran, though the Iranians endeavored not to release them until after Carter was out of office, after the stroke of noon, and that is indeed what happened, and JFK and Eisenhower on their way to the inauguration. Next slide. The Trump inauguration. You see Donald Trump and Melania Trump walking to the White House, as a new tradition has already developed. Go ahead with playing the audio.
Inside this adorable kitten, incredible forces are driving an amazing transformation. For this, their young bodies need to digest 2 times as many proteins as adults. And in their first year, their tiny bones must strengthen to be 4 times stronger than concrete. Royal Canaan Kitten is tailored nutrition to support their healthy development.
I, Donald John Trump,
the inauguration of the 45th President of the United States, Donald Trump, and a seismic shift in power here in Washington.
The President-elect of the United States, Donald John Trump.
The office of President of the United States.
From this day forward, it's going to be only America first. And yes, together, we will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
Next slide, please. Oops. Hello? I've lost them. Just a minute.
Are you seeing that slide, Ron?
I'm not seeing the slide yet. Hold on, let me get it.
Sure, take your time.
Are we there? Can you see me and hear me?
Yep, it's on the letter.
Okay, very good. I apologize for that.
No worries.
In these days, we're all moving along technologically, some of us more quickly than others. Part of the whole tradition is the famous letter that presidents leave for their successor. George H.W. Bush to Bill Clinton. You can look at this. It's a short letter, but it's a very warm one. I wish you great happiness here. I never felt the loneliness some presidents have felt. There will be very tough times, made even more difficult by criticism you may not think is fair. I'm not a very good one to give advice, but just don't let the critics discourage you or push you off course. You will be our president when you read this note. I wish you well. I wish your family well. Your success is now our country's success. I'm rooting hard for you. Good luck, George. Next slide. Bill Clinton to the son of George Bush. Today you embark on the greatest adventure with the greatest honor to come to an American citizen. Can you hear me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Yep, you're good.
Okay. You lead a proud, decent, good people, and from this day you are president of all of us. I salute you and wish you success and much happiness. The burdens you now shoulder are great, but often exaggerated. The sheer joy of doing what you believe is right is inexpressible. My prayers are with you and your family. Next slide. President Obama to Donald Trump. I won't read this all, but congratulations on a remarkable run. Millions have placed their hopes in you, and all of us, regardless of party, should hope for expanded prosperity and security during your tenure. And then goes on to say, we are just temporary occupants of this office. That makes us guardians of those democratic institutions and traditions like rule of law, separation of powers, equal protection, and civil liberties that our forebears fought and bled for. Regardless of the push and pull of daily politics, it's up to us to leave those instruments of our democracy at least as strong as we found them. I'll leave to others to decide whether that was achieved. Michelle and I wish you and Melania the very best as you embark on this great adventure, and know that we stand ready to help in any ways that we can. I wonder whether there will be a similar letter left in the desk in the Oval Office from President Trump to incoming President Biden. Next slide. Just a few odds and ends as we close about the ceremony. There's a joint congressional committee on inaugural ceremonies that's in charge, a 6-member bipartisan committee. It's now chaired by Senator Roy Blunt, Republican of Missouri, and including leaders McConnell and other key members, and Nancy Pelosi. Budget for this committee of about $1.5 million. And it will be, well, we don't know what's going to happen because of security concerns. There was a specially constructed platform that holds 1,600 people, including prominent members of the president's entourage, the Congress, the Supreme Court, former presidents. President Carter will not be able to attend, but President Bush and President Obama will. President Trump has said that he is not going to attend, and other key figures. The crowd below can be several hundred thousands or much smaller. Those with invitations up close or those without spread throughout from the Capitol to the White House. In 2013, I was a presidential elector, and thus I got an invitation to the inauguration, which my wife and I thought was pretty nice. And indeed it was, although we were far, far from the podium, and had to go through quite intensive security. It was like getting on an airplane, but it was still an exciting event. I had written this before the events of the past week, my question about whether Trump would show up. And outgoing administration members is still an open question. Vice President Pence apparently has said that he will indeed attend. Next slide. The order of events, traditionally, there's a morning worship service. Traditionally, though not this time, there's a tea at the White House that the president has for the incoming president, the ride to the Capitol, opening remarks by the chairman of the committee, a prayer, usually a musical performance and or a poem. Maya Angelou has spoken. Robert Frost gave a poem reading. The vice president swearing in, then the president swearing in, the inaugural address, and the benediction. Next slide. There's after that a luncheon in the Capitol, the parade. I don't know what we'll have this time. The former president's departure, concurrent with the luncheon for the current president. This time will be different. And the inaugural ball. Sometimes there are many inaugural balls. Next slide. President Biden's inauguration, the multi-day events. There will be a day of service on Martin Luther King Day, a memorial, it is said, to lives lost to COVID-19, and a special tribute to healthcare and frontline workers. And then on January 20th, the ceremony. Next slide. The impact. Some inaugurations create a very positive aura. Some are more controversial. What will the Biden inauguration be like, and what impact will it have? Next slide. How will COVID affect things? Who's working on the speech? What tone will it strike? What promises will it make? What will be the spirit of the day? What will the crowd be like? I don't think there will be much of a crowd. The mayor of Washington, D.C. has asked people indeed not to come. There's some talk that maybe for security reasons, the inauguration should be held indoors. The president-elect has said that will not be the case, but we will see. Again, who will be representing the administration. And the security measures, I am sure, will be enormously intense. Next slide. There's still a commercial aspect to this. When I started doing my research for this, I communicated with some people and thus got on very many email lists, one of which asked if I contribute money to this inauguration and to buy some of the inaugural gear that's for sale. Next slide. And those are our video clips. But that is all. I'll be happy if we have a few minutes to take any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Ron. I really enjoyed your trivia in the beginning and your video content throughout. And your attention to all the little details of what the weather was like and whatnot. It's fascinating. We did have a few questions roll in. Sure. We probably have, we'll spend 5 to 7 minutes on questions and I'll read a few off to you now.
Okay.
The first question that came in was, when did the wives begin to participate in the inauguration? And for those of you who haven't asked questions yet, you can do so in the Q&A feature of Zoom rather than the chat, and we'll see how many we can get through. Did you hear that first question, Ron?
I did. Wives played a minor role until more recent times, basically sitting up on the main platform, and sometimes not even there. Herbert Hoover's wife barely made it in time. I don't know if they would have proceeded with the ceremony had she not yet been there. Lyndon Johnson's wife, Lady Bird, was the first to hold the Bible on which the president took the oath. And that is a tradition that continued with every succeeding First Lady.
Another question, are there any documents or writings from George Washington where he realizes that his presidency and inauguration was so symbolic and will dictate ceremonies to come?
It's a good question. And the only answer I have is what is in his inaugural speeches, including his very brief second inaugural address. Washington was not one who kept intense diaries of his thoughts about that, but it is a good question. Perhaps they exist and I'm not aware of it.
So going down the line, let's see. What is your favorite inauguration and why?
Well, this is probably going to be an odd answer. Franklin Roosevelt's 1945 inauguration struck exactly the right notes and fit exactly the needs of the time. Provided reassurance. It was, of course, very brief, cost less than $25,000, and was an opportunity for Roosevelt to give, in a very brief statement, a vision for what we hoped for in the post-war world. He quoted Emerson saying, "The only way to have a friend is to be one." And at the end of the speech, he said that we would strive to fulfill God's will to peace on earth.
It's powerful. Let's see, which inauguration had the most former presidents attend? Do you know that off the top of your head?
Interesting question. President Obama's inauguration had George H.W. Bush, who was somewhat incapacitated at the time, and of course President Clinton, and of course George W. Bush. That's 3. The presidents who had the most presidents still living at their time did not have many in attendance. There were about 5 presidents alive when Lincoln became president, but John Tyler, one of the former presidents, was busily helping to form the Confederacy. So of course he was not there. So I would say 3 is probably the number. Carter? Oh yeah, and of course Jimmy Carter was at President Obama's inauguration as well.
Yes. So this next question, what was the first presidential inauguration to be broadcast on radio and TV?
I believe Calvin Coolidge's on radio in 1925. On television, Dwight Eisenhower's inauguration in 1953, it was noted that Lucille Ball was in I Love Lucy, had higher ratings the night before than Eisenhower's inauguration did the next day.
So let's see, maybe we have time for like one or two more questions. I don't want to keep you too far past 8. Were there any security issues in any of the past inaugurations?
There were intense security concerns, as mentioned, when I went to the second Obama inauguration. Security was intense. Of course, during the war, during World War II, security was one of the reasons that FDR held his 4th inaugural at the White House grounds rather than the Capitol. The security was dealt with very professionally, and there was always a great effort in presidential inaugurations not to make them seem like a military occasion. But in 1969, in 1973, at the Nixon inauguration, security was intense. So there have been inaugurations where there has been a concern, but I think that we will eclipse them all next week.
Yeah. And I'll end on this last question, which is actually a good lead into next week's talk. Let's see if you know a little bit about this, Ron. How far back has the establishment of the presidential libraries, how far does that go back, presidential libraries?
The first I'm aware of in an official sense was Franklin Roosevelt's library at Hyde Park in the 1930s. Roosevelt donated part of his estate to that purpose, and every president since has had a library. There have been historians who have complained that presidential libraries are scattered around the country, making harder for historians to do their job. Too bad. I think that it's appropriate to have presidential libraries in places related to the presidents.
Well, thank you so much, Ron, for being with us tonight and speaking to this full crowd. I think we had about 150 people on, and I just want to thank you for your time and sharing your expertise.
Thank you. I apologize for a few of the technological glitches, but thank you, Kayla, for your great help.
Very happy to help. Are you willing to, some people might want to email you afterwards. Are you willing to share your email address with people?
Absolutely.
Great.
And should I put it in the chat box?
That would be excellent. Yep. Put it in the chat.
Okay.
Thank you so much, everyone, for coming out and tuning in. If you're interested, next week, we're going to be talking about presidential libraries. So make sure you sign up on the library's website. Okay. Perfect. So Ron just put his email address in the chat. He's open to answering those questions that we unfortunately didn't have time for tonight. Thanks again, Ron.
Thank you. Good night.